Guys, I'm Roger Hohm. I worked with the irrigation industry for about 36 years, retired about a year and a half ago now, and they wanted somebody to come and talk about some history of irrigation, so that's why they get the old farts in. And Shelley Woods, Dr. Shelley Woods, still work with Alberta Agriculture with the Irrigation Department here, so we're going to kind of tag team this a little bit this morning. I'm going to talk about a little bit of history of irrigation. How do we get the water here to start with? And then we're going to kind of break into two groups. Half of you are going to walk over, we're going to start walking through and kind of the history of the on-farm irrigation, everything from flood to where we are today, and some of the why did we change and why did we go where we went and that type of stuff. And Shelley's going to talk a little bit more about some of the precision agriculture and efficiency in irrigation and that type of stuff. So just to get things going then, history of irrigation. We got a really long history here. Actually, the first water where we're standing here got to this place in September 1900. So we've got a fairly long history. So I'm going to kind of talk about the history of irrigation in kind of different blocks here. So anybody from up in the Strathmore or the Brooks area in this group? One person. Okay, so good to see you. So I'll just touch on that a little bit. Irrigation in southern Alberta really got started in kind of 3 or 4 different phases. The first one is the company phase, and it really started with railroads. We had a prime minister, the first prime minister of Canada, said, you know what, if we are going to become a nation, we got to take a railroad from eastern Canada all the way to the Pacific Ocean. We got to tie this country together. So they contracted the CPR to start building a railroad. And the CPR got about to Winnipeg and looked to the west and went, why would we build a railway out there? There's nobody there. But they knew they had to do it, so they went back to the government and said, okay, for us to build this railway, we need something more than just cash to build it. We need to get people there, and to get people there, we need to have land. So what the federal government did at the time is from Medicine Hat all the way through to the mountains, they gave the CP rail every alternate section along the railroad. And you think of a section as 640 acres. Well, a section to them was a mile wide by 24 miles deep. So almost a township. So every alternate township from Medicine Hat to Calgary was given to the CP rail to build it. And that amounted to about 3 million acres that the CP rail got. So now they've got all this land so they can sell it to the people. And if the people are there, they're going to grow crops. And if they grow crops, the railway gets to ship the grain. Life is going to be wonderful. So they started building this thing, but it's kind of a dry part of the century back in the 1880s. So they said, to get people here, we're going to have irrigation. So the first blocks that they started the western block, and they started the eastern block, and then there's another chunk of 1 million acres in the middle here that they never did develop. The western block was first. So they put a diversion, and everybody drives down Deerfoot Trail in Calgary, sees a control structure and a canal along Deerfoot Trail. That's where the first diversion was actually put in 1906, 1907 to irrigate about 130,000 acres in the western block. They got 1 million acres there, so they irrigated about 20 or 30,000 acres to start with, started selling the land off. Basically, they went bankrupt. Eastern block, the CP rail started doing the same thing. They built the Bassano Dam, and if anybody's been there, it's a massive structure. It was built in 1909. So these guys were innovators. They were going to irrigate about 400,000 acres in there. They got about 100 to 120,000 acres going. By 1935, same thing. They were basically broke. So what ended up happening is the CPR said, we got to get out of this thing. So the eastern block, they set up with the farmers there. They said, you guys take it over. We'll give you $300,000 in cash, and you can have the other 600,000 acres that are in there for nothing. So that's really how the Eastern Irrigation District got started. They had some cash, Now they got 600,000 acres. And if you look at Eastern Irrigation District now, another thing that happened was, oh, they found a little bit of oil in there. And they had the mineral rights. So Eastern Irrigation did quite well. Western section was kind of the same thing. They gave them $400,000. They turned over the acres to them. But the Western Irrigation District immediately sold off all the acres because they're close enough to Calgary. They sold a lot of it. So they've had some financial troubles for quite a while, but they're doing better. Down in our area here, down here, we had almost the same thing happen, except it was the Galts. They were coal miners, and they found a bunch of coal here in Lethbridge. So how do you get the coal to market? Well, you got to take a rail line to Medicine Hat to tie into the CPR, or you take a second rail line down to Great Falls, Montana. So same thing, they went to federal government. Federal government says, gave it to the CPR, we'll give it to the Galts. Every alternate section along there ended up being about 1.2 million acres in here that the Galts end up having. And the same thing, got dry times, nobody's here, we got to irrigate it. The second thing that was happening at the same time was down in this far corner of the province here, there's an opportunity for the United States to divert water from the St. Mary's River, which we all get our water from here, through the Milk River and back to the United States. And the US in the 1890s actually sent in a survey crew and started design work to divert the entire St. Mary's River into the Milk River and back in the United States. So in 1894, the government of Canada said, oh, we got to stop this. So they implemented the Northwest Irrigation Act, which basically says anybody who has use of the water gets first use of the water. And because it was an Irrigation Act, domestic use got water first, municipal use got water second, and irrigation got water before any other uses then. So that really pushed saying, let's get some irrigation going here because we have to say we have a right to the water because we're using the water, and then the federal government can start negotiations with the US. And so that's really what happened. So in 1900 or 1887, 88, they started building a canal from down here south of Cardston, up through Spring Coulee, through McGrath, over to Raymond, through Sterling, and finally a branch line into the city of Lethbridge. So 1900, we got our first water here. So that's really how it got going in the first stage. Then the second stage come along was called Irrigation District Stage, because all along this was just a bunch of volunteers. There were a bunch of groups of farmers together that wanted to irrigate, but they had no authority really to tax people. So the early 1900s, we got in some pretty wet weather. And people had these ditches built and nobody were using them. So who's going to pay for something you're not going to use? So in 1915, the Alberta government enacted the Irrigation Districts Act, which allowed a group of farmers to get together and gave them the right to tax land for water. And that's basically what you run under today. So basically, your water rights that you have is basically a tax. And they're actually very strong taxes because they're actually can be claimed back before a municipality can. So your water rights are very important. So back in 1915, they actually enacted that. So the first district to get started was Tabor in 1921. And they got that because they needed to get another branch line to get into that Tabor area. So their group of farmers got together very quickly and got going with it. The next one was Lethbridge Northern Irrigation District. They didn't have a railway going through there. They didn't have a company building it. So they got all the farmers together and floated a bond in 1919 for $5 million. That's a lot of money for a group of farmers to throw together back in 1919 to start constructing works. They started building it off the Old Man River, basically right at Brockett. Took water across in the Fort Macleod area, all the way to the Iron Springs area. In 1921, they became a district. And the year after they constructed their works, we had a major flood and took their entire works out. So they had a $5 million bond that was floated that was completely washed away. The Alberta government stepped in and helped them out at that time. So all the districts kind of very quickly, once they got that right to tax the farmer to ensure they were going to get money every single year to own and operate it, the districts got together and started going really, really fast. So the next stage that came along was the government phase, and that was really about the Second World War. And a group of federal government employees called PFRA, Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, was enacted. And that basically was to come in and start helping rehab and start developing irrigation projects. The Bow River Irrigation District, this one in the middle around Vauxhall area, again, it was a company, but it was not a railway. It was actually a bunch of cattle ranchers from England that put the money together to develop the irrigation that goes all the way from Carsland, all the way through here and into this area. In fact, the original design didn't stop at Hayes. The original design went all the way to Redcliffe. And they actually even were starting the siphon to go across the Bow River and up the other side. And they got most of it built, and then it caught on fire because it was a wood siphon, a wood tube, caught on fire, burned up. Otherwise, we may have actually had irrigation all the way to Redcliffe. So when the federal government stepped in, that was the first district that they actually walked in and said, okay, we got to take over the works of this. They actually walked in into the St. Mary's project here. And so from about 1940 to 1960, the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation, or PFRA, were very, very active in designing, constructing irrigation projects. So the St. Mary's Irrigation District really didn't even become a district till 1968, I believe. I'm looking at Len Ring here. You might have the number, but about 1968. Before that, it was federally operated. Same with the Bow River District. So those districts are very, very new, comparably, even though they've had water since 1900. Okay? And the last phase that came in was irrigation rehab. And in the early 1960s, the federal government, the provincial government, being pushed really by the irrigation districts, got together and said, we've got now 75-year-old infrastructure here, 75-year-old infrastructure. Most of it was originally built out of wood and earth ditches that were pulled wherever you could happen to get a ditcher through. This stuff is really getting in bad shape. So they did a study, and it came out, that study said that 86% of the cost of irrigation should be held by Canada and Alberta as a whole, and only 14% to the farmers. So in 1968, they actually started an irrigation rehab program where it was a cost-shared program, 86-14. The farmers of the irrigation districts paid 14% of the cost of that rehab. The federal or the provincial government put in 86% of the cost. That program since 1968 is now up to just over $1 billion, has been invested by the provincial government in irrigation rehab. That's why we go around the country now. When I started back in 1980 with the provincial government, one of the biggest things we had was salinity. And at that time, we estimated it was somewhere around 20 to 25% of our irrigated land were saline. Big problems, seeping ditches, very inefficient irrigation systems, et cetera, through this irrigation rehab program. And of course, the provincial government put in $1 billion, you as farmers put in another $1 billion. So we've invested about $2 billion over the last number of years. But we're down to now, when we did the last survey, less than 2% of our land is actually salinity caused by irrigation rehab, or caused by irrigation. So massive change. But if you look around the world, people around the world come to southern Alberta now to see what infrastructure really needs to be, because we have almost 50% of our canals now are in pipelines. All of our structures are being replaced. All of our open channels are now gravel armored, they're lined. We've got the state-of-the-art irrigation system here that is envied by everybody in the world. So that's kind of where we came from and how we got there. And now let's go look at, half of you are going to come with me and we're going to talk about the on-farm side of how we changed history. And Shelley, I'll turn you loose on this side.
Sounds good. Thanks, Roger.
Okay. Well, I guess I should ask any questions before we get going there. Okay, let's go over.
So for you folks that are staying, why don't you come in a little closer? I'm operating on one vocal cord, so seriously, a little bit of surgical error back in December. So anyway, Roger kind of gave you that long history. I'm going to talk a bit about sort of the scale of irrigation in southern Alberta. How many of you folks are irrigation farmers? Great. Okay, so we got a few, and I know, George, you work with a lot of irrigation farmers, so good. Have any of you heard of Growing Forward too? Good. I see a couple nods. Excellent. So that's a program. I want to just start with that right at the outset. It's a program that the provincial government is managing to help assist farmers in paying for upgrades to their irrigation systems, so modernizing them. Our side of it is we want to improve efficiency and use less water. From your point of view, you're going to pay less for fuel and just be able to irrigate more, manage your irrigation much better. So I have with me here Adele Harding, and she works with us here in the provincial government, and she's the one that's implementing the Growing Forward 2 program. And I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, just sort of the statistics and how much money you're able to get. But if you're interested today, Adele is the gal. You can get her card and get her information, and she can certainly give you more details on how to access that money. Basically, you can get up to $15,000 per parcel. Of course, it's on a cost share basis and a percentage, but we'll get to that in a bit. So I wanted to talk first. I mean, Roger kind of talked about the whole history of irrigation in Alberta, and I wanted to just tell you a bit about the scale of irrigation that we have in the province. So this map here shows the irrigation districts in green, and all the little blue dots you can see here show the private irrigation. So we've got the district irrigators and the private irrigators. And the difference there is the district irrigators, that's all licensed by Alberta Agriculture. And for the private irrigators, they get their licenses through Alberta Environment. So that causes a little bit of confusion. And just to toot our horn a little bit, with agriculture, we seem to do a little better job of maintaining statistics. So when I talk about some of the data here, it's all unfortunately just based on district irrigators, because we're the ones that have all that data. Environment doesn't collect that. But anyway, I just wanted to say we've got irrigation right from the border with Montana all the way up to the confluence of the Peace and Wabaska River. I think we sometimes forget about that. We think about the scale of irrigation here. Of course, with private irrigators, they're the ones that are responsible for getting that water from the rivers. So some of these guys have just massive pumping costs because they're pumping quite a high head. The river's way down in the valley, and so they've got those costs. In the districts, of course, the districts are responsible for bringing that water right to your farm gate, as I'm sure some of you know. But overall, we've got about 1.4 million assessed acres in the districts and about 259,000 assessed acres on private. So private isn't, it's about 25%, so it's still like a significant portion of the irrigation that happens in the province. What else did I want to say? So irrigation overall is about 4.7% of the land base in Alberta. And if you can believe it, the amount of irrigated land in Alberta is about 25% greater than the whole province of PEI. So you start thinking about that, it's a massive scale. Our irrigation in this province makes up 60% of the irrigation in Canada. So we're a very significant player, and I think we sometimes forget that. So we need to really toot our own horns on that. We've got 42 district reservoirs. So those are off-stream reservoirs that the irrigation districts manage. That would be like Lake Newell, different reservoirs like that. And then there's also 15 provincially owned reservoirs. Those are the ones that are usually on stream. So things like the Old Man Reservoir. And we've got nearly 8,000 kilometers of conveyance works, pipeline and ditches and that. It's massive. And 4,800 kilometers of drainage works, because we forget, we need to bring that water to the farms, but we also have to carry that water on through and get it back into the river streams. So a lot of that, and those drainage works can be very useful during times of flooding, as we've learned recently as well. And then 170 major structures, so weirs and that. So overall, the replacement value of our conveyance systems is around $3.5 billion. It's significant, and there's also 8 hydro plants. So some of the economic benefits, there was a report that just came out 2 years ago that Brent Patterson did for the Alberta Irrigation Projects Association that talked about some of the direct and indirect benefits of irrigation in southern Alberta. So there's 3.6 billion is contributed to the annual GDP. It's a big deal. A lot of that, significant amount, 1.3 billion, goes to revenue just for the governments, Alberta and Canada. Tons of labor income, 56,000 jobs are due to irrigation. We always think, well, that's the irrigation farmer, but hey, there's the dealers, the guys that are selling pivots and pickup trucks and coffee at Tim Hortons, right? It's a big deal. And remember I said 4.7% of the cultivated land base in the province is irrigated. From that, we get 19% of the total primary agricultural sales. So we know we get higher yields, but we also, it's 20% of the provincial agri-food sector GDP. So not only higher yields and more diversified crops, but we've got a lot of the processing down here too. So yeah, very significant. And we also, I think sometimes we face that reputation that, oh, rich irrigation farmers, those guys, the government gives them everything, hands it to them. But really, of the economic benefits of irrigation, only 10% goes to the irrigation producers. The other 90% goes to the region and the whole province. Like, for example, IPEX, the folks that manufacture the pipeline that they use for converting canals to pipeline, that's an Edmonton company. So, those money are going to Edmonton. So, yeah, I'm really pro-irrigation and tooting our horn. So this graph here shows you the amount of irrigated acres and assessed acres for irrigation going back to 1911 up to 2015. I just wanted to comment, you could see some massive growth and changes in the 70s and 80s, and some of us are old enough to remember that, some of us maybe not. But we've sort of seen that leveling off in terms of the acres, and some of that is due to just the moratorium on water licenses. But the neat thing that I wanted to point out here is this is the diversion, the amount of water that is diverted each year for the districts. Again, like I said, we only have district statistics, but it's actually been declining. So why is that? Well, sure, we've been in a bit of a wet cycle here, since around, 2008, 2010, bit of a wet cycle. But also, I think we're seeing another trend there, and that's due to efficiency improvements. And that's kind of what Roger and I are here to tout here today. So what have we seen here? When Roger's going to talk about the on-farm improvements, that upgrade from the old flood irrigation to pivots and what that's meant. But there's also been improvements on the conveyance, how we get that water to the farm gate. So Roger talked about how they pulled those old canals, some just dug a hole sometimes. Sometimes they may have just built up banks of canals rather than dig a ditch. There's some issues with that, of course. You get weeds and ducks making nests, and so they're not all that efficient. Water doesn't move as well. So they've done some upgrades. In the 70s, they tried putting in concrete liners. With mixed success, of course. Turns out we have freeze-thaw cycles here in Alberta, and which they don't in California. So, I mean, it depends on how that concrete gets poured, but you can actually see one of these if you came down Jail Road on your way here this morning. There's one just along the road there, and you can see it's all broken up, and we like to use that as an example. Then, of course, they went to the membrane liners and then put armor, which armor is just the rocks of all different sizes, and that not only holds down the membrane, but also kind of controls the speed of the water flow, slows it down a little bit. And then finally, that moved to buried pipelines. And I think the trend we've been seeing in pipelines is just that diameter getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I think they're up to 60 inches now, which is just incredible. And so Roger talked about the Irrigation Rehabilitation Program, that one that they've had going since 1968, and improving this sort of infrastructure. And so I've got some stats on it, and we won't cover it too much. Now, he said about the 86 to 14% ratio that the government versus what the districts, well, in about 1994, they switched that to 75-25. So the districts actually pay now 25%. And since 1969, there's been $1.127 billion invested. And of that, 900 million have come from the province and 230 million from the districts. So it's a significant investment. Here, this just shows you the dollars that were put in the green is the government and blue is the districts. And then this is the type of rehab they did. So there's, in green here, that little blip, that was those concrete liners. They were really popular for a little bit, and then they kind of backed off on those for obvious reasons. And then the one I just want to point out in blue is pipeline. So we've just seen more and more pipeline. This is kilometers. So we've got, like, there's that total nearly 8,000 kilometers, and you can just see that in blue here is the closed pipelines, and the number of kilometers of that keeps increasing, and the open pipelines just keep decreasing. And you know, we think, well, sure, there's great benefits to going to a pipeline, a lot more efficient in how you move the water, less seepage, less evaporation from that, but also when you take that land that used to run a canal and put a pipeline in there, now you can farm that land again. So, I mean, there's just multiple benefits to these improvements. And what's that, George?
As it doesn't take as long for us consultants to get from field to field.
Yeah, that too, that's right. You don't have to go all the way around. See,
buried grass, and all of a sudden you're going in.
yeah, that's right. Whoops, I forgot that was there. Yeah, so the other thing is, well, you think, well, boy, the government's putting a lot of money into this just for a bunch of rich irrigation farmers. And we forget that that water is used for a heck of a lot more things than just putting water on crops for irrigation farmers, right? There's livestock producers use it for cattle watering. 42,000 citizens get their water from irrigation infrastructure. So that's the city of Brooks and a farmer out in the middle of nowhere and everybody in between. So there's 50 municipalities, those rural water co-ops, farmsteads, they all get their water from that rural industry, the oil and gas industry, food processors, they're getting their water from the infrastructure. We also use it for flood and erosion control. You remember that flood in 2013 now, is it, in Calgary? You know what massive damage it did. We had some issues here too, but I think they were able to control a lot of that by filling reservoirs and letting water out at different times. They use it for in-stream flow requirements. So as you know, we've got to let a certain proportion of our water go through to Saskatchewan every year. And sometimes those river flows are so low, we're not going to meet that. So they'll drop a little water out of the reservoirs to kind of meet our requirements there, our apportionment agreements. There's hydro generators, as I mentioned. And then, of course, there's all that recreation, right? We can think of Lake Newell and people windsurfing and water skiing out there, but also a lot of golf courses. I think there's 27 provincial parks get their water from irrigation infrastructure. And then finally, that water that is drained away, some of that, a small proportion, is used for waterfowl and wildlife habitat. There's 87,000 acres. So a lot of uses for irrigation water, and we need to kind of get the public to understand that it's, as I say, not just a bunch of rich farmers. But we do, as irrigators, use a lot of water, and we know that. So of the water that's allocated in the South Saskatchewan River Basin, a full 3/4 of it is allocated to irrigation. And in fact, when you use that water, 78% is used by irrigation of the water that's actually used. So there's 9.3 billion cubic meters on average flows through the SSRB, South Saskatchewan River Basin. 5.4 billion of that has been allocated, and typically half of that allocation gets used. So 75%, as I said. But when we look at the overall flows, we're supposed to let half of it flow through to Saskatchewan, but typically on average 76% flows through to Saskatchewan. But we're still using a large proportion, and so because of that, it's incumbent on us to do our best to use that water efficiently. So this is kind of a really nice schematic that shows you how the water gets to the farm and some of the different structures and things like that. But the point I just wanted to make off of this is we need to remember our water comes from the mountains, from the snow that falls each winter and melts, and a little bit of glacier melt is where that water's coming from each year. So we don't have the same issues that you hear about from like the Ogallala aquifer down in the States, where they've got really huge pressures for water. That's great. It's an annually renewable resource here in southern Alberta, but that also comes with risks, right? Not every winter you don't get the same amount of snow. You can't count on the exact same amount of water. So we've certainly got benefits, but risks as well. So I had about a 40-minute talk on irrigation crops and the trends we've seen, but I'm going to try to do it in about 2 here. Just wanted to show you overall in the districts, because again, we only have data on the districts. About a third of the crop area is in forages and about a third in cereals. And then of the rest, we've got about 14% in oil seeds. That's predominantly canola, let's be honest, but there's a bit of flax in there too, and some safflower and mustard. And then about 18% in those specialty crops. Those are the things like potatoes and sugar beets and dry beans. So in 2015, that's the latest data we have that came out last year. The top 13 crops I've got listed here: hard red spring wheat is king, canola and alfalfa hay. Those three are all over 100,000 acres in those three crops. But we do still have some of the special crops on this list: dry bean, potatoes, all show up, alfalfa seed. One neat thing we've seen, I think it was in 2012, corn silage finally exceeded the acres of barley silage. It's just been coming on slowly but surely, and I think we're going to see that trend continue. Cornification of America, and I think we're starting to see it a bit here. But that's overall, that's all the districts, and I thought it'd be kind of neat just to point out the difference between some of them. We won't go through all 13, but I've got here Lethbridge Northern Irrigation District. That's Feedlot Alley, right? So there you see, it's predominated by forages, by and large. Let's look at what happened in 2003 after BSE was discovered in Alberta. It dropped just ever so slightly, but just quickly kind of went back to normal. It has been pretty flat ever since. Much fewer, the pink line are the specialty crops, so much fewer there. But when we look just a little further to the east of the LNID in the TID, the Tabor Irrigation District, that pink line there, that's the specialty crops. So it's right up there, competing with cereals, and forages are slightly on a decline there as well. And as I said, I have this long presentation to go through all the different crops, but I think I just wanted to point out potatoes, because that's kind of a neat one, where we saw the immediate and massive impact of the Lamb Weston plant that was built in April of '99, and then the McCain plant at Chin from April of 2000. Those happened right there, and the acres in those 4 years of potatoes doubled. So, I mean, that's where we really need to be putting government efforts, I think, is getting these processors in place. Then you can get these high value crops going for folks here. So we're almost there. We get one more poster to go. So I'm kind of doing a hodgepodge because I wanted to cover a bunch of things. So irrigation management, that's kind of my thing, what I do in terms of research. And what that is, we always think of RAT. We call it the RAT: rate, amount, and timing. Those are the three things you got to think about when you're irrigating, right? Like how much can I put on an hour? What can my soil take? You need to know those kind of things. How much total does this crop need right now? How much can the soil hold? All that kind of thing. And then the timing, what stage is the crop at? So those are based on a whole bunch of factors that are important. Your crop characteristics, your variety and type of crop, the stage of growth that it's in, and your soil characteristics, things like water holding capacity, the infiltration rate, climate. How much precipitation have you had? How much are you going to get? This can be very important. And number one there, potential evapotranspiration rate. How much is that crop using? I think Roger's probably going to talk about it a bit too. The public sees folks irrigating in the rain and thinks, well, geez, what are these idiots doing? Well, first of all, they ordered that water 3 days ago, and that water's coming down the pipe, so you bloody well better use it, or there's going to be trouble. But secondly, yeah, it's raining, but maybe you get 3 mils, and that crop's using 7 millimeters a day. So that water really, that precipitation may not be effective. And that's sort of another bugbear I have, that I feel like the public really needs to understand that. That we've done a number of surveys and found that irrigation farmers, if anything, are under irrigating typically. They're, that water wastage just is a thing of the past.
And you get a lot more efficiency when you water in the rain too, because you don't get near the evaporation.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right, George, for sure. So I just wanted to say that with Alberta Agriculture, because we got to kind of do our own advertising here, we have a number of products to help farmers with their irrigation management decisions. So we do some research and demonstration out at the demo farm. I don't know if you guys are aware of the demo farm. It's just about a mile south of here. And on Thursday, just to let you know, the federal government is having an open house at the research center. It's free to the public. I think it starts at 9:30 in the morning, and there'll be tours of the demo farm included there. So come on out. That's to celebrate Canada 150. So anyway, we have, as I say, the demo farm here in Lethbridge. We also work at CDC South, the Crop Diversification Center South in Brooks. And we have Bow Island Substation where we do research as well. We've got a bunch of publications. So we've got the Alberta Irrigation Management Manual. These are all available online. Fact sheets for 11 different crops on sort of pointers on that specific crop, because that may be all you're interested in. And we've got this little irrigation management field book, just a little blue book. And Adele's got a bunch of them over at the table there. If you think you could use that, you're more than welcome to help yourself to them. And then this booklet is put out each year on the information. It's where I got most of the statistics from here. And it is quite interesting actually to grab a hold of that, and that's available online too. We do a number of conferences. So I organize the Irrigated Crop Production Update, and it's coming up in January of next year. We do it every other year, sort of with agronomy update. And so our focus is more on irrigation. We do workshops, and I think Adele's going to be kind of taking over. We recently had Dave Highland retire, who ran these workshops, and Adele's going to pick up that baton. And we have some web-based support tools. So we have the Irrigation Management Climate Information Network. It's a bunch of weather stations that you can really help you. And we also put out Irricast from that, which is a crop water use report. So you can just go on there and put in what crop you've got, when you planted it, where you are, and it'll tell you about how much water that crop's needing each day. So that can be like a very simple way to do it. But then we also have the Alberta Irrigation Management model, which is a little more complex, but you can really tailor it to your fields, and it can help tell you when and how much you should be irrigating. We've got Corvan Ray Farms uses that AIM model, and what's Abe's last name? Martin's. You know, he's got 130 pivots that he manages, and so he uses AIM for that, because there's just no way you could manage 130 pivots on your own, just getting out there every day and sampling. It's impossible. So we're working with Washington State University, and we are kind of piggybacking on their app, which is called Irrigation Scheduler. So that's an app for your smartphone. And then there's the Alberta Irrigation Energy Calculator. So finally, that brings us back to Growing Forward 2. That's the program that we run that Adele organizes. And so it's again, a government program to give money to irrigation farmers to help upgrade their systems. And so producers are eligible to apply once per parcel per system. New purchases, if you're buying a new pivot to replace gravity, side wheel, or a high pressure system, are covered for up to $15,000 bucks. And also, even if you're just maybe upgrading your older low pressure system, or just changing your nozzle packages from a high pressure to a low pressure system, you can get up to $5,000 bucks for that as well on a 40% basis. So just in the last fiscal year, Adele has processed 583 grant applications. Approximately $4.39 million was distributed to producers, but those farmers in turn spent about $27 million to get those upgrades. So, you know, again, the government's helping, but the farmers are also taking a large proportion of that. And then this final little map here shows you the irrigation districts and the different cities. So where are we looking at here? There's Calgary and Lethbridge and Medicine Hat. So all these little dots show where the different farmers are that got money. So it isn't just a bunch of folks around Lethbridge. It's really been widespread across the districts. But we're trying to promote it as much as we can. So I think that just about wraps me up, and it looks like Roger's getting to the end there too. So we can swap if you guys like. There's also pop and something to drink over there in the cooler if you guys are getting dry. Goodness knows I am. Yeah. Any questions? Nope.
Good job.
Okay, well, thanks guys. Yeah. Good. Yeah, and we've got some